Shuhei Hisagi has gained something of a reputation of late for being the everyman Shinigami, a decidedly average warrior who nonetheless strives to try his absolute best at everything he does. Even if this reputation isn't completely fair, as Hisagi is a very talented and skilled fighter in his own right, something that's brought up by other characters within the source material, it feels like he mostly brought this reputation upon himself. After adapting to the betrayal of his former captain Tosen and shouldering the immense burden and responsibilities of the 9th Division in a seemingly better and more level-headed fashion than his fellow Gotei 13 betrayees, Izuru and Hinamori, he became the poster boy for the model officer, a workhorse whose dedication enabled him to put duty above emotion. It's easy to forget that for a long time, Hisagi was a big old nothing of a character and didn't receive any meaningful panel time or development until the fake Karakura Town arc, which catapulted him to the forefront of fan popularity and perception in a meteoric way. Even Kubo himself was surprised by Hisagi's sudden surge of regard among the reader community. Compared to Izuru and Hinamori, who were both spotlighted in the Soul Society arc as the tormented vice-captains of the traitorous Aizen and Gin, Hisagi was never given that same treatment. Yet by the time his story was complete, I'd argue his conflict, his clash with his former captain, was the most compelling, the most electrifying of the three by far. That maturity Hisagi displayed in the wake of Tosen's betrayal elevated him greatly, and that maturity is paid off tenfold in their final coming together. And of course, all this nascent popularity Hisagi was receiving would result in a character who would go on to be treated pretty weirdly in the following arc. And while the character analysis videos on this channel only cover the source material, it should be known of course that the combination of his everyman persona and huge following led Hisagi to be chosen as the perfect lead for the light novel trilogy Can't Fear Your Own World 2. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. It's time for the next Bleach character analysis video, and I appreciate that I didn't put out a poll this time to decide on it. Don't worry, they're still happening. For some reason, I just really felt the urge to talk about Shuhei Hisagi. So in this video, as we always do, we'll be taking a look at who Hisagi really is as a character in the world of Bleach. What's his role? His purpose? What about his visual design? What is it about him that made him so appealing, so popular, so suddenly? Without further ado, let's take a look. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach videos like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And a massive thanks, as always, goes out to everyone supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. And before we dive into this video, there will, of course, be spoilers for the 1000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach ahead, so you've been warned. So, who is Shuhei Hisagi? Throughout the entirety of Bleach, he holds the position of the vice-captain of the 9th Division, technically stepping up to be the acting captain during the Arrancar Arc after Tosen's betrayal and disappearance, though this never seems to be formally ratified in any way. His lifespan in the source material stretches from chapter 72 right the way through to the Hell chapter at the very, very end of the series, the most recent chapter. So he's been with us for most of the journey. Despite that, like I mentioned earlier, Hisagi is sidelined heavily until essentially the latter third of the Arrancar arc, with very little really known about or seen of him until then. Even his very first appearance in the series as Ichigo and the others prepare to face Jidanbo just outside the gates of Seirete feels kind of random and thrown in, like he was simply one of a crowd of extras who happened to get promoted later on down the line to a full supporting cast member after Kubo decided that there was more he could do with this guy, that he liked the initial design he came up with. I'm not saying that is what happened, it's just funny to see both him and Izuru so nonchalantly included here among this group of Shinigami kind of musing on the situation unfolding. At least, in a way, Izuru might make some sense, assuming this is the 3rd Division barracks Ichigo and the others are currently trying to intrude upon, and you can assume as much with the arrival of Gin himself later on. And so if that is the case, Hisagi's just there. And so right from his first appearance, it seems like Hisagi has always felt like something of an underdog in Kubo's eyes, someone who picks up the slack, who carries out the thankless jobs. In that sense, it's perfect then that he's become so popular among fans of the series. So popular, in fact, that his first real fight was given truly amazing treatment in the anime. It was a tentpole moment in the run of the anime itself. It still makes me laugh as well that Soifon smirks and Hitsugaya stops and says finally when Hisagi activates his Shikai. Like, for some reason the captains of the 2nd and 10th Division were waiting with bated breath for this moment. But it's mostly just an acknowledgement for the fans that yes, it's finally here, and it's a big deal because this character gained so much from this moment in the original chapter's release. Hisagi is a really unique character in my eyes. For a Shinigami, I always got the sense that he came across as a very human person, which is ironic because in the Arrancar arc, he actually questions Ukitake on whether or not Rukia having a human friend is really a good idea. But there's a boyish, roguish charm to him. Despite his dour punk rock appearance, he's a plucky individual just trying to make his way in the Soul Society. There's something earnest and heartwarming in seeing him taking on the leftover responsibilities of his division, like the Seirei Communication Bulletin, for example. Hisagi now being the editor-in-chief of the Soul Society's news magazine adds another dimension to his character, one that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And it's of course that inherent inquisitiveness that makes him perfect to take the lead on Can't Fear Your Own World. We mentioned at the very start of the video that Hisagi has garnered a reputation for being the average Shinigami, yet we know from the source material that he's an outstanding combatant. When Renji, Izuru and Hinamori were in the academy, they looked up to and respected Hisagi not just as one of the older students, but as something of a celebrity figure among them. So then, if that's the case, where does this reputation stem from, and is it justified? I think this is why. It's his well-rounded nature, his maturity, yet also his humanity too. I love the small details, the fact that he supposedly brought a motorbike back to the Soul Society from the human world and got in trouble for it. You know, like, he's a bit of an idiot, but he's a lovable idiot, and he's supposed to hold this position of authority, and you see him balance that. You see him carrying out the tedious jobs, the hard work, and at the same time he's getting chastised by the higher-ups because, yeah, he is a bit dumb at sometimes, and I actually really like that. I love that he's trying to learn guitar, but his sessions are supposedly so annoying for his fellow division members that eventually Chad has to take it upon himself to help teach him. And I enjoy how the supplementary material has only fleshed out this kind of goofy side of Hisagi further. For example, his childish boyhood crush on Matsumoto, only to be spurned virtually every step of the way. Kubo took this character who began the series as this very self-serious, dark and brooding figure. You know, you go back and look at the Soul Society arc and he really is like that, and turned him into someone who is quite relatable and down to earth. That's not to say there isn't a quiet darkness to Hisagi as well. What made Hisagi so compelling, outside of the superfluous elements like his appearance, the appearance of his Zanpakuto, was that darkness. The innermost elements no one really expected. Hisagi is one of the few Bleach characters to embody fear as one of his major motifs, which might be surprising from the outside looking in, but I think that's partly the point. Unlike, say, Asnod, who is very openly all about fear to even a superficial degree, Hisagi's fear, the fear that controls him, is a lot more subtle. In a battle series where almost all conflicts are solved through fighting, having a prominent character be terrified of battle, of the death and destruction he can potentially wreak, is fascinating, a fascinating character trait. Not only is he scared of battle itself, but also of the power he wields in his Zanpakuto, which is the entire premise behind the name Can't Fear Your Own World, which itself is taken from the title of chapter 384, Can't Fear Your Own Sword, the start of the battle between Hisagi, Komamura, and Tosen. But he holds and harnesses that fear close. Those who don't fear the sword they hold are not worthy to hold it. Having a Shinigami have a credo like this and be so resolute in following it is really cool. Of all the characters in Bleach that were at one point in a position to do so, it feels to me like Hisagi is perhaps the worthiest of eventually becoming a captain, along with undoubtedly Renji too. Hisagi has displayed the requisite power, the necessary strength and resolve, but more than anything, it's his dedication that really stands out to me. When it comes to Hisagi's visual design, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag on the whole. I've always got the impression that Kubo didn't quite know what to do with this character's look, so just kept on piling on components. That's why Hisagi's face is just covered in both scars and tattoos, with 3 large slash marks down his right-hand side, while then on the left side he has the famous 69 tattoo in honour of Kensei Muguruma, which we'll get into, and a black strip tattoo across his nose, which was the last tattoo he got. We know that the chain link around his arm is actually a detachable bomb, which is a really cool little detail that he uses against Findorr, but the one around his neck may very well be just another tattoo, though I don't think it is, as he changes it after the time skip, though I guess he could just get the tattoo altered as well. There's actually a joke in one of the chapter omake where Izuru kind of wonders if the thing around Hisagi's neck is another bomb after all. In fact, if you remove a lot of the more superfluous visual design elements from Hisagi's face, he really does kind of resemble Ichigo in a way, outside of a few different factors, like for example the shape of his eyes are different to Ichigo's, but outside of that he does look quite similar to our main character. And as far as his hair goes, for the most part he has a pretty basic standard spiky anime look, but like with a lot of other characters he gets a more realistic hairstyle after the time skip, one that is decidedly less anime in general, if that makes sense, and to be honest, I probably prefer his newer hair overall. As with a lot of the cast, it helps him look more like a real person. As far as his design goes then, if you take a step back and look at Hisagi, on the whole you get the impression that this should be a messy and noisy design, but it somehow works quite well. Maybe it's just that I'm used to his look overall, but it all comes together quite nicely. It feels like an intricate balancing act almost. One more scar, one more tattoo, and I think he would be over-designed certainly, but here, Kubo manages to pull it off quite nicely. Hisagi has that punkish outward appearance, which of course is juxtaposed with his playful naivety, as mentioned earlier, and it overall creates a character that is very engaging, very appealing, and it's not hard to see why he became so popular. His Zanpakuto Kazeshini combines well with this appearance. It was certainly surprising when it was first unveiled. 2 double-edged scythes attached by a chain, which Hisagi can control with terrifying deftness, confusing his opponent with the weapon's seeming erratic and unpredictable movements as the blades spiral and slice through the air. It's a very sinister, cruel, and wicked-looking Zanpakuto, which again I don't think anyone really expected. I remember loving it during its initial reveal, and this absolutely undeniably helped propel Hisagi as a character to stardom. I just recall no one really anticipating it, that this character who, until this moment, really hadn't done anything of note, would suddenly have such a cool and unique Shikai that exemplified Hisagi's own ice-cold philosophy of fear on the battlefield. Of course, the character and the Zanpakuto's own popularity would only heighten further with the introduction of the Zanpakuto Rebellion filler arc. Again, not part of the source material, but a small thing I think that's worth bringing up, which painted Kazeshini himself as this shadowy, Joker-style anarchistic renegade, which people absolutely loved as well. Quickly, Hisagi and Kazeshini were two of the most talked about supporting characters in Bleach. What's really interesting about Kazeshini though is how it's been effectively transformed by the supplementary material. What started out as a devilish but ultimately fairly simplistic Shikai has been given an all-new special ability as a result of Can't Fear Your Own World. And again, while I said we don't normally consider material outside the source in these videos, I think the supposed true nature of Kazeshini is just too big not to mention. It's believed that the true nature of Kazeshini lies not in its dual blades, but in the chain that connects them. That the chain represents the cycle of life and death, the very essence of what it means to be a Shinigami, which again takes us back to this idea that Hisagi is very much at the core of what a Shinigami is, what their role is in this world. It's further revealed that Kazeshini's true power is to restore any injury Hisagi receives, even fatal ones, so long as he has Reiatsu remaining. The chain of his Zanpakuto will actually pull his body back together again, and this is supposedly how Hisagi survived major injuries even in the source material, like when he was sniped by Lil Barrow, for instance. I think this is a cool, if potentially extremely powerful ability for Kazeshini to have, and I dive into it a little deeper in my video dedicated to Hisagi's bankai. At the same time, I don't think Kazeshini needed a power like this. It was already a dangerous weapon, and Hisagi's incredible control over its wild, almost untamed and sweeping motions was what made it a real threat, and was what made it so interesting, visually so interesting to watch. Plus, there was the nice connection to Kensei too. Both had a Zanpakuto with at least some tangential relationship to wind. As far as the supporting Gotei 13 cast goes, we're allowed a pretty hefty insight into Hisagi's past that really helps shape the man he becomes in the present day. As far back as 100 years before the main storyline, we see a very young Hisagi running terrified from a gigantic hollow before he and his friends are rescued by Kensei and the 9th Division. Although Kensei berates him, he also orders him to stand tall, remarking that Shuhei is a good, strong name, even though as a child Hisagi basically spends the whole time blubbering. But for just a brief flicker of a moment, Hisagi overcomes his tears and was inspired. His eyes light up as they fall on the 69 tattoo on Kensei's chest, and it's in that moment that Hisagi finds an idol in the man who saved his life. It's nice that we get this brief snippet that Kubo really didn't need to showcase, especially since Hisagi's spotlight hasn't even occurred yet, but perhaps Kubo felt the need to justify Hisagi's questionable tattoo choice, and now we know why he has it, where it comes from. He has it inscribed upon his face out of reverence, out of respect for the man who saved his life. Meanwhile, Kensei bears the 69 tattoo because it has a double meaning for him. I believe, off the top of my head, the 6 comes from the surname Muguruma, which I think has one of the characters 4-6 in it, or something akin to that, whereas the 9 is simply out of reference to the 9th Division. But a fair bit of time later, chronologically, though appearing earlier than this in the source material, we also get to see Hisagi during his time as one of the older students in the Shino Academy. Here, he's leading a field trip outing to the real world to help the younger students with their first Konso rituals. And I actually quite like his appearance here, the longer, slightly more unkempt hair, the studded choker, plus he now has his first tattoo, that 69 on his face. Izuru notes that Hisagi is famous among Shinigami students for having already secured a place within the Gotei 13 before even graduating the academy, which of course is very unusual, and again, this highlights how skilled Hisagi actually is, but in keeping with the character he would seemingly later become, Kubo can't let Hisagi have this victory without also bringing him down a couple of notches as well, kind of again trying to highlight that underdog nature as Izuru kind of comically reveals that Hisagi has actually failed the entrance exam twice already, however. Although the training exercise goes smoothly at first, Hisagi and the others suddenly come under attack by enormous hollows capable of completely cloaking their Reiatsu, and though he wouldn't know it yet and wouldn't know it for a while, these are of course experiments of aizen. Hisagi is struck across the face by a hollow with long, thin claws, giving him his prominent scars that we would know today, and just as he prepares to face off against them, Renji, Hinamori, and Izuru come to his aid. This is an awesome shot, and of course it's cool to think they'd all become vice captains together in the end. But as they're surrounded on all sides by these colossal hollows, and it seems like it might be all over for them, Aizen and Gin come to save them. Much later again, we get one last glimpse into Hisagi's past, during his time as a seated officer in the 9th Division. On a beautiful, sunny, grassy hill, a downtrodden and defeated Hisagi summons his captain, asking to be dismissed as a seated officer. Tosen believes it's because of a mistake Hisagi made in a training session the other day, but to Hisagi it's a failure that runs deeper than that. That mistake he made the other day was a symptom of a bigger problem that's haunted him for virtually his entire life as a Gotei 13 officer. Since he was attacked by the Hollow that night during his time in the academy, he's been shaken to his very core. He trembles when he steps foot onto a battlefield. He feels a cold sweat when wielding his blade. He takes an instinctive half-step backwards every time he enters a fight. At the core of it all, Hisagi is afraid. He's become terrified of fighting, and as far as he's concerned, that basically renders him completely and utterly useless to be a Gotei 13 officer. Unknown, however, to Hisagi at this moment, he's just begun to embrace that which in the eyes of his captain, in the eyes of the 9th Division, truly makes him a warrior. But now let's move on to Hisagi's bigger role in Bleach. Like I said, it starts out slowly, very slowly in fact, with Hisagi taking on something of a background supporting role in the Soul Society arc. But as we've mentioned already on the channel, Kubo liked to alternate between shining the spotlight on particular vice captains per each different arc, and Hisagi is not one of those vice captains initially. I think what makes this stand out more than normal is that despite being the vice captain of one of the divisions that loses their captain, Hisagi simply doesn't get the same spotlight that the other two vice captains of the other two betrayed divisions do. So he comes across as something of an outlier in comparison. You get the impression, at least as far as Kubo's concerned, that his plight, the plight of the 9th Division, simply isn't as important, even if that's not true. But anyway, let's move on now to the Soul Society arc. Initially, as we mentioned near the start of the video, Hisagi is seen in Chapter 72 for the first time, along with Izuru and other Shinigami reacting to Ichigo's arrival at the gate. This first appearance of his, there's not a big deal made of it at all. His face is mostly cut off by the edge of the panel, in fact, which again kind of reinforces this idea that perhaps Kubo hadn't quite yet decided what he was going to do with this character. In fact, Hisagi's first real appearance doesn't come until after the death of Aizen. He appears to greet his captain outside the 4th Division barracks, where he questions Tosen on the outcome, and Tosen confirms that Aizen is indeed truly dead. But here, there's no real insight afforded into Hisagi, his personality, or really anything like that. In fact, like I said earlier, in the Soul Society arc, Hisagi is really just depicted as this very straight-laced, flat, wooden, cold character who's mostly just here, it seems, to kind of fill the numbers of the vice captain for the time being. And then later, Hisagi joins his captain on the battlefield, confronting Zaraki and the Ryoka. When Ikkaku and Yumichika decide that they want in on the action as well, Zaraki allows them to peel off with the vice captains of the enemy side as well, Hisagi and Iba. And Hisagi himself pairs off with Yumichika, and once again there's no real insight into Hisagi's personality whatsoever. He's presented as being very cold, very distant, even quite aloof. And I think it's very telling of his current treatment, his treatment in the Soul Society arc, that really, he gets less spotlight than even Tetsuzaimon Iba. Meanwhile, Hisagi, you barely see any of his situation with Yumichika because Kubo deigns to not spend as much time on Yumachika in general, and therefore by extension Hisagi is the least focused on out of any of these four characters in this moment. So it's just kind of weird to see the reversal of fortunes, how Hisagi would eventually go on to become just completely eclipse Iba in particular in terms of his actual screen time and prominence. But again, here, once again, there's no real insight into Hisagi's personality whatsoever as he takes down Yumachika. He's very cold, very distant, even quite aloof, simply saying that it won't matter where they go to fight, clearly viewing himself as far superior to this fifth seat. And initially he does defeat him, apparently with ease, watching the activation of Tosen's bankai from afar, and Hisagi kind of says that, you know, maybe he should go and help out his captain, but Yumachika's not done just yet. This is admittedly a nice scene, even if it's really for Yumachika as opposed to how much it's for Hisagi. You kind of get the impression that their worldviews are quite different, maybe even that Hisagi looks down upon the 11th Division. You get the impression, actually, that a lot of the Gotei 13 does. Even if the 11th Division is tough and macho and vicious, you do get the sense that they are kind of seen as the lower class of Soul Society by a lot of these more self-righteous characters. The 9th Division, of course, being exceptionally self-righteous under Tosen's leadership. But, you know, Yumachika says, I'm not done yet. We in the 11th Division believe that it's only honourable to go down fighting. You know, you can't just give up. And Hisagi says, well, you know, it's not like that in the 9th Division. But of course, Yumachika reveals his true Shikai, which shocks Hisagi. But of course, his defeat actually happens off-screen. When we return to Hisagi, we see that he has been beaten by Yumachika's true Shikai, though we don't know what it did, but Hisagi drops a big hint, saying that Zanpakuto is completely unfair, as it totally drained him of his Reiatsu. As he's lying there, however, though, like splayed out on the floor on top of one of the buildings, he suddenly notices Yamamoto's immense power as Ryujin Jaka is released for the very first time. Hisagi looking afar at the incredible flames billowing in the distance. And you know what? Knowing what we know now, I'm not going to say this is an intentional callback, but it's a nice moment where Hisagi looks on from a distance at the incredible power and force of Yamamoto's flames in awe of this character, and then flash forward all the way to the 1000-year Blood War arc, and these two characters are brought together, seemingly disparate characters that you wouldn't expect necessarily to get any face time together, Hisagi and Yamamoto, for a moment that almost feels like a full circle moment, where Hisagi in the Soul Society arc was gazing at this power from afar, and then here in the 1000-year Blood War arc, he is seeing that explosive, destructive, fatal energy of Ryujin Jaka up close, and Hisagi is of course just like shocked and completely awestruck by the power of Yamamoto's flames, to the point where Yamamoto reassures him after walking past him. Hisagi is the last Shinigami to actually see Yamamoto alive, which is really cool, as of course Kenpachi is unconscious by the time Yamamoto takes on Yuha Baku, you know, Roid Lloyd. So that's a really cool moment. I'm not going to sit here and say that's an intentional tie-in or callback or full circle moment, but it feels really neat nonetheless. And Hisagi, of course, is later devastated to hear about Tosen's betrayal. You see him kind of being carried by a few officers after his injuries, but he goes to Sokyoku Hill for the final confrontation, where he apprehends Tosen himself. However, Tosen escapes into Wako Mundo, and Hisagi looks on in horror, noticing a giant eye behind Aizen in the Garganta. And that, again, is kind of cool. Even though Hisagi played an absolutely tiny role here in the Soul Society arc, he was the one to notice and call out what would eventually, many years later, be revealed as Hulir in the Fate Karakura Town battle. Hisagi then visits the grave of Tosen's best friend, and this is kind of where Hisagi's real purpose as a character begins to be defined. He discovers Komamura already there, which again, this is a nice moment. The two of them form a bond and pledge to open Tosen's eyes, really setting into motion one of the bigger subplots of the Arrancar arc to come. Little did I know it then, but this meeting between Hisagi and Komamura as they kind of stand by the grave of Tosen's friend, the wind howling softly behind them, it's a really just great moment, and little did I know it, but this would be the precursor to one of my favourite fights in the entire series. But then after that, Hisagi decides to join Izuru and Rangiku in drinking together and kind of forgetting their problems regarding Gin, and Hisagi kind of is just shocked by the absolute state that Kira is in. But the Arrancar arc is when things start to change for Hisagi. They start to get a little better for him, his outlook looks a little brighter, but even then, it doesn't happen for a while. Hisagi is first seen approaching Ukitake, who is overseeing Rukia and Orahime's training. Hisagi is, doing the rounds, he's delivering the Seirei communication, which is now his job as editor-in-chief, having taken it upon himself to carry out the tasks that Tosen never actually delegated to anyone else. So in a sense, Hisagi never really understood the full weight of the captaincy position, and like I said, while he's not officially really even an acting captain at this point, that is essentially the role he now has. And again, you get this sense of maturity from Hisagi. You get this sense that he was able to get back on his feet very quickly and keep the 9th Division from falling into despair, even if that means taking on tons and tons of work himself. Now, if I'm remembering this correctly, the 9th Division is one that we don't ever learn the 3rd seat for, at least not in the present day. That might have been quite interesting, perhaps, to get to see Hisagi interacting with the 3rd seat, to see how he is now maybe delegating some of these tasks just so that he's not crushed underneath the weight of them. And also, interestingly, for some reason I can't see Tosen going round delivering the magazine, dropping off newspapers essentially, which has been a core duty of the 9th Division for many years, but I guess he must have done if Hisagi claims that this was a task that Tosen used to do himself. But regardless, this isn't a big part for Hisagi. It kind of just feels like Kubo perhaps included him here to remind us that he exists, because like I said, he's really not seen a lot during this first part of the Arrancar arc. But once the fake Karakura Town arc begins, things change for Hisagi in a big way. Though he isn't present immediately when the battle first kicks off, he's revealed to be, along with Izuru, Ikkaku and Yumichika, one of the powerful warriors selected to defend the pillars keeping the real Karakura Town concealed. A pretty big job given to only some of Soul Society's most capable warriors that aren't quite captain class. And it was cool. I remember when this scene first happened, not only is there 2 awesome double-page spreads showing these guys in action, but many of us correctly assumed that this meant Hisagi was actually going to be given a fight on screen properly for the first time. Same kind of goes for Yumichika, but at least Yumichika had his moment against Ganju. I'll be totally honest as well, I completely forgot reading this weekly that Yumichika had some special Zanpakuto that he hadn't yet revealed. Obviously, if I'd remembered that, I would have been more excited to see his inevitable battle as well. And I guess Kira too, though like I said before, he was spotlighted in the Soul Society arc anyway. We saw his small battle against Matsumoto. We basically knew what his Zanpakuto could do. And the same goes for Ikkaku, though of course he wouldn't eventually get a fight at all here. But yeah, Hisagi was the one I remember really people were like, we're looking forward to finally getting to see this guy in action. And when Hollows do attack those pillars, when Baragon reveals he knows the location of these pillars and they can immediately take them out and return the real Karakura Town to the battlefield, Hisagi and the others instantly kill these Hollows before facing off with Baragon's fraction. Thinking about it, I think Hisagi's battle against Findorr is probably my favourite of the Baragon fraction fights, although most of them are decent. It's nice that they only really last a chapter and a half at most each. Some of them do go a little bit beyond that. But this fight is really, really cool. And of course, this fight does have a bit of weird prestige surrounding it because of how incredibly it was treated in the anime, which I'm almost certain is down entirely to Hisagi's popularity, how much popularity he gained from this specific moment in general. But Hisagi faces off against Findorr Clarius, who claims to be able to fight at a vice-captain level. And Findorr has a really neat gimmick. It's an interesting gimmick. Basically, he smashes his mask to increase his power level. Apparently, his power is able to increase perfectly incrementally from 5th to 4th to 3rd seat to vice captain, and then at least according to him, to captain. But we get a pretty decent fight here. It is substantially extended in the anime to the point where you get Findorr using Sero and Bala, stuff like that just doesn't happen in the source material at all, but Hisagi is eventually overwhelmed, but at long last he unveils his Shikai, Kazeshini, despite being cornered by essentially this veil of high-speed water. Hisagi uses his Shikai to slice through it and turns the tables. And it really is funny because this is one of those fights that I remember not necessarily better, but it's definitely had more impact on me in the anime. And I think a lot of that is down to the community reaction, how much people just adored this fight. Hisagi espousing his values as that incredible soundtrack plays. I think it's unnamed. I believe it was released as part of the Fade to Black soundtrack overall, but regardless, it's incredible as, you know, his voice actor does such a good job. Hisagi spinning Kazeshini as he says, you know, you're not afraid of your own power. I am. And you get that whole philosophy of Hisagi's as the music plays. The animation is crisp and beautiful and fluid. But regardless, the core of the fight is the same between both the source material and the anime. Findorr isn't afraid of his own power, doesn't understand how Hisagi can be afraid of it, calls him egotistical, basically being like, you know, oh, you're afraid of your own strength? How vain. And Hisagi says, well, you know, those who aren't afraid of their own power don't deserve to wield it. Findorr smashing that last part of his mask, laughing maniacally as he's like, I've now reached the power of captain, you know, you don't stand a chance against me, but Hisagi just uses Kazeshini to instantly cut his Resurrection in half. In a sense, very similar to how Hisagi takes down his captain. After this, Findorr has just completely lost sight of the battle of his own power, and Hisagi completely turns that against him. Up until this point, Findorr has just not been able to read this thing at all. Of course, there's that great moment where Hisagi intimidates him by hanging the sickle down in front of his face. Great panel imagery where he says it looks like it's been, you know, it looks like it's designed to take lives. And so eventually Findorr does feel the fear and turns tail and tries to flee from Hisagi. And Hisagi gives off this that incredibly badass line. Another thing that people just fell in love with. You don't see the killing blow in the source material, but you know it's the end. And Hisagi says, you know, on the same level as a captain, give me a break. I won't shy away from the fact that although it's kind of superficially badass, it is a great moment. And of course, the anime takes this a step further by just completely evolving the end of this fight. Findorr, you know, feeling that fear, fires a Sero at Hisagi, but Hisagi just launches Kazeshini through the middle of it. It's more cinematic, it's more dynamic overall, and it strikes Findorr in the face, basically. And the way his shadow, his silhouette kind of moves, it looks like he's been decapitated by it. I'm not entirely sure he has, but regardless, it's gruesome when Findor's body hits the floor with a real sickening squelch. But Hisagi watches in horror as Ikkaku's pillar is destroyed and intercepts a distraught Yumichika, basically saying, you know, what are you going to be able to do against someone who defeated Ikkaku? And then later, when Aion defeats both Rangiku and Momo, Hisagi and Izuru come to the rescue, with Hisagi taking on Aion with Kazeshini, using the Kido Suzuri Raiden in conjunction with his Zanpakuto's chain, really clever, to electrocute the monster. However, Hisagi is surprised when Aion tricks him. It was all a feint. The creature is basically unharmed and can rip himself free of Kazeshini seemingly whenever he wanted, grabbing Hisagi, smashing him into a building, and almost crushing him to death. Luckily for Hisagi, Aion seems to just get bored, I guess, and throw him away, but the vice captain is defeated for now. And much later, as Hisagi lies defeated on the ground, he is shocked to see Kensei arriving with the Vizard. And I actually have to kind of wonder about the timeline here. Since Kensei would be exiled from Soul Society mere days after his first encounter with Hisagi, I wonder if Hisagi ever really knew about him. Because it would be a good few years yet, presumably, before he actually joined the academy, so where did Hisagi learn about Kensei? By the time, maybe Hisagi joined the academy with the intention of working under Kensei, but by the time he presumably was indoctrinated into the Gotei 13 itself, recruited as an officer, Kensei was long gone by that point. So I kind of wonder if Hisagi ever knew anything about him, basically, if he was ever told anything about Kensei, because the Vizard, their reputation was probably not so stellar at that point. They would have been known as these hollowified, monstrous Shinigami, presumably on the run with known criminals like Kisuke Urahara. So that's really interesting to me. Hisagi does seem to be very surprised, of course, to see Kensei even alive at this point. So maybe he hasn't been told anything, but he does say in the Thousand Year Blood War arc that he always looked up to him, which is interesting to me as well, based on what presumably the public perception of the Vizard was at the time. But regardless, we never really find out how Hisagi comes to know anything about Kensei, despite only seeing him as a small child, and Kensei leaving the Soul Society basically mere hours later. But regardless, Hisagi gets another fight in the Fate Karakura Town arc, intercepting Komamura's battle with Tosen, claiming to want to open his former captain's eyes. And of course, this is the culmination of that great moment at the end of the Soul Society arc, the journey that Hisagi and Komamura have been walking together. The path has always been leading them here to this fated moment. And this truly is one of my favourite fights in the entire series. The pathos, the emotional payoff here, it's all accounted for, and it's all handled excellently, to the point where I don't want to spend too much time on it because I really do think this fight deserves its own battle analysis at some point in the future. But Tosen chastises Hisagi as the battle begins, saying, you want to open my eyes? I thought I told you and taught you about fearing the weapon you hold, and if you don't fear it, you don't deserve to wield it, and you haven't changed. There's no fear in your words whatsoever, clearly trying to unnerve Hisagi. Whereas, of course, truthfully, it's Tosen who is the one who is lost. Tosen is the one who has forgotten everything, his mantra, everything he taught Hisagi is basically all gone. But Tosen activates his hollowification, shocking and horrifying Hisagi before attacking him, sending the vice captain crashing down below. And as Tosen battles Komamura, Kazeshini's chain whips upwards, wraps itself around Tosen's neck, and slams him onto a building, where Hisagi grabs him and pins him down, questioning him about his motives, their shared past, their shared ideology, and asking what the captain possibly fears now, after having basically letting himself fall so far, straying so far from what his original perceived idea of justice supposedly was. However, Tosen simply callously stabs Hisagi through the stomach and kicks him from the roof. However, once Tosen has transformed and defeated Komamura, it seems all is lost. But out of nowhere, Hisagi pounces on Tosen, stabbing his former captain through the head. Despite clearly being in pain both physically and emotionally, there's a great tiny panel of Hisagi closing his eyes, as you can imagine him exhaling, as he realises what he must do, as he makes peace with what he's about to do, and it activates Kazeshini inside Tosen's head, killing his former captain. And as Tosen dies, he transforms back and wants to look upon Hisagi's face one last time, before suddenly exploding, and Hisagi is horrified, screaming out for his captain as blood gushes into the air and Komamura turns seething with rage at Aizen above. Despite Hisagi being pictured among the fighters who are seemingly going to take on Aizen when Aizen challenges them, Hisagi doesn't actually play a role in that fight whatsoever, and the last time we see him in the Arrancar arc is when it looks as though the captains have actually prevailed against Aizen. Hisagi looks elated. And then 1 month later, after the battle, in the epilogue of the arc, it's revealed that Hisagi is off now training with Renji. And then we come to the 1000 Year Blood War arc, as Hisagi doesn't make a physical appearance in The Lost Agent. And as I've mentioned before on the channel, Hisagi has a bad, weird time of it in this arc, to the point where it feels like Kubo resented Hisagi's sudden surge of popularity and wanted to seriously knock him back down to reality once again. Hisagi is just steamrolled repeatedly in this arc to a comical degree. He gets a decent amount of screen time, but nearly everything he does in this arc is him getting seriously beaten up, to the point where you think his body would be almost irreparably damaged after the amount of injury he takes over and over and over again. And it seems to only get worse for Hisagi as the arc actually progresses. And it's interesting because it feels to me that this is where Kubo has decided to start changing how Hisagi should be perceived. Like I mentioned, a lot of people really liked that sort of superficial, cool badassery of Hisagi when he takes down Findorr, and of course there's the emotional heft of his battle against Tosen. Now admittedly, with Tosen's death, that is kind of the end of Hisagi's own subplot, of his own real development, and so where is left to take this character? And this is where Kubo really begins to build that kind of boyish, roguish, everyman personality for Hisagi, where the character kind of drops some of that more serious outward facade and becomes a little more goofy is not the right word, but he's used more for comedic effect here than he was previously. But he first appears during the vice captain's meeting where they're discussing the disappearance of the Rukongai citizens. And then when the Vandenreich invades, Hisagi proceeds to engage Sternritter O, the overkill Driscoll Bursey. And I remember, chapter 495, you see the Sternritter pairing off against their Shinigami opponents, and when Hisagi was highlighted as being one of these fights, I thought to myself, okay, Kubo is carrying on this trajectory from the Fate Karakura Town arc. Hisagi is clearly, again, going to be a major player because of his popularity, but that simply does not happen. The next time we see Hisagi, he is being completely overpowered by Driscoll, slammed into a building before Driscoll tries to kill him with a gigantic arrow, much the same way he did to Chojuro. But of course, Yamamoto would arrive, saving Hisagi and battling Driscoll himself. Hisagi is our kind of spectator, he's the audience surrogate for this fight, watching in awe at Chojuro's bankai and even preparing to aid Yamamoto when he thinks the head captain has been knocked out. But Hisagi continues to just watch in shock as Yamamoto incinerates the Quincy down to the bone. And Yamamoto then tells Hisagi not to worry. You get this nice moment where they kind of pass each other by. Hisagi sort of still standing, shell-shocked by what he's just witnessed, and Yamamoto reassures Hisagi that he will kill all of the invaders. And again, this is a nice moment, the kind of everyman, average representation of the Shinigami contrasted with the might of the Captain Commander, and again, it almost feels like a full circle moment from that scene in Soul Society arc. And so, with the first Quincy invasion finally behind them, Hisagi obviously survived the fight, and he, like every other Shinigami who survived, has now been afforded a chance for reflection, some crucial downtime. And Kubo drew a supplementary chapter that honestly offers us a really intriguing insight into how Hisagi chose to spend at least some of that downtime. This next portion of his story takes place just before he heads off with Kensei and Mashiro to start training for his bankai. This takes place just before that. And it's a really awesome, tiny little chapter that Kubo didn't really need to do, but I absolutely love that he did. And basically, we see Hisagi praying at somebody's grave, and he's interrupted by the arrival of a Shinigami who may or may not be familiar, Auga, who was one of the 6th year students who helped Hisagi lead the academy field trip back in that other flashback. And the grave that Hisagi is praying at is that of Kanazawa, the woman who was killed by the gigantic hollow that could hide its spiritual pressure. We all thought Auga was killed as well when he is struck, but he in fact survived. We see he still has a massive scar on his face. And you find out that he too, like Hisagi, was afflicted by a crippling fear ever since that day of stepping foot on the battlefield, as you would rightly expect, I think. But unlike Hisagi, Auga basically changed course entirely and decided to join the 4th Division instead so that he wouldn't really have to fight anymore, and would instead be charged with basically helping heal the injured after a battle. And there's a really interesting dichotomy here almost between how Auga seems to feel about Hisagi. Because on the one hand, he has real, genuine admiration for Hisagi. He says, you know, I wasn't able to conquer my fear, but you have done exactly that. You've managed to overcome it, surpass it, and push it down, and even managed to reach the rank of vice captain. You know, you're amazing. I would never be able to do that. And so he does seem to have some kind of genuine admiration for Hisagi, but there's a quiet sadness to this scene as well, a sense of the somber and the melancholy, as Auga seems to almost not quite accuse Hisagi, but imply that Hisagi hasn't come to see Kanazawa pretty much ever since he's become a vice captain. He's just become too busy, you can assume, with all of his newfound duties, and as such, she's kind of not necessarily been forgotten, but, you know, Aoga says, you know, it's been ages, it's been years since you've been here, and Hisagi turns around to him and says, you know, don't say it like that, you know, make it sound like you come here all the time. To which Aoga says, in a very matter-of-fact way, I visit Kanazawa every month on the day she died. And it's a tough moment. I'm not really sure what Kubo's trying to say here about Hisagi, or what lesson he wants Hisagi to learn from this meeting. It's a poignant meeting and a really powerful supplementary chapter. It seems to me like it's about Hisagi reconciling with the fact that, yes, he has kind of left these people behind because he has had to take on greater duties, greater dedication, but really they've never left his heart. And it's almost like Aoga and Kanazawa are an analogy for the fear that has rooted itself in his heart ever since, in his core. That same fear that he, you know, lamented to Captain Tosen, it's still there, it's always been there, and it has never left, and that's what these two characters almost seemingly represent. And the fact that Aoga keeps on coming back to Kanazawa, obviously it's a good thing to do, it's a noble thing to do, he respects and still cares for her, but I think it's also a metaphorical way of showing that he hasn't been able to leave that day behind, ever since. It has controlled his life ever since that very moment, whereas Hisagi has, despite that traumatic event, tried to reach for the stars, despite that fear inside of him. But regardless, this is just a tiny snippet, a glimpse into the lives of a couple of Shinigami differently affected by a trauma that occurred in their past. During the downtime between invasions, Kensei takes Hisagi out to the Rukongai, where he begins training him to learn bankai. Mashiro arrives and, despite Hisagi's protests, punches him in the gut, and Kensei warns him that he isn't as soft as Tosen, to which Hisagi says you have no right to badmouth Captain Tosen like that. I've been on record before that I don't really like that scene, I think it makes no sense, so we won't go into it too much here. What was interesting about this, of course, was, again, despite Hisagi getting destroyed by Driscoll in the first invasion, we weren't at the point yet where it became a running theme for the character, so I was still on board with this idea that Kubo was going to give Hisagi more prominence in this arc due to his reception in the last arc. And the fact that he was going to learn bankai seemed to only double down on that. And again, little would I know at the time that we would never even see this bankai throughout the entirety of the source material. But when the second Quincy invasion begins, Hisagi is not seen during the first daylight hours. Instead, once nightfall descends upon the battlefield, Hisagi stumbles upon Ikkaku and Yumachika, who are against moving about too much in the dark, which seems pretty clever to me, except they're all ambushed immediately by Mask de Masculine. And although Mask takes Ikkaku and Yumachika out straight away, Hisagi is conscious enough to prevent him from leaving with Kazeshini, using the chain to wrap around Mask's leg. And while you might be thinking this is a good showing for Hisagi that he was able to remain conscious, all this does is lead to an increased beating, as Mask yoinks Hisagi towards him with his own Zanpakuto before clotheslining the vice captain, sending him crashing to the ground before Mask was probably going to kill him by stomping on his head with his gigantic boot, which seems really gruesome. If that had actually finished, just the ferocity, the velocity of this panel makes it look like Hisagi's head would have been burst open like a watermelon or something, but Kensei, of course, arrives in time to save his vice captain. As if things weren't going bad enough for Hisagi, Kensei lays in with the jabs, saying his pathetic excuse for a vice captain basically being defeated without even getting a chance to show off the fruits of his training. The whole bankai subplot is so weird. It feels like Kubo did want to show it, but legitimately just never got the chance to, and then basically lambasts Hisagi for that, for something that's not even really Hisagi's own fault. But regardless, when it seems like Kensei has defeated the sternritter, Hisagi's able to rise up again and warn his captain that they need to kill James instead, but he then presumably falls unconscious. The next day, Hisagi, along with Ikkaku and Yumachika, all presumably healed somehow, whether they simply came to without any member of the enemy army finding them and healed themselves, arrived to confront the sternritter who were trying to capture Ichigo. Hisagi, with Kazeshini active, rushes into battle, but as with everyone else, he is separated off-screen and blown away by Yhwach's immense shockwave. When we return to this part of the fight, Hisagi later has supposedly defeated a sternritter off-screen, though I've always thought that he was talking about Pepe and the love just hadn't kicked in yet. Hisagi arrives to tell Byakuya of his victory. Again, maybe he was told by Pepe to tell Byakuya that he'd been defeated so Byakuya wouldn't go and look for him. But regardless, Hisagi begins attacking Byakuya, seemingly against his will at first. But as Hisagi's mind begins to succumb more and more to the love, Pepe's ability, he goes on the offensive until Byakuya once again knocks him out, ramming his sword hilt essentially into Hisagi's gut. And then later, the love forces a wounded Hisagi to rise again, blood spilling out of his mouth as he takes Senbon Zakura, which Byakuya had discarded, and uses it to battle the captain further. This is where, I've said it before, I think I said it in my second invasion video, things just get really messy for me, and characters who are both zombified and under the control of the love begin fighting each other, and it just gets really crazy. Kensei arrives, and Hisagi, who is now just seemingly completely mad with love, with a desire to kill Byakuya, leaps into the fray just without a second thought, but the zombified Kensei just beats him up, literally just punches him in the gut before slamming his head onto the ground. You guessed it, once again knocking Hisagi out. I think that's like 4 times in the space of this arc so far that he's been knocked unconscious, which is absolutely ridiculous. But Hisagi is later brought back to Urahara's headquarters, presumably by Byakuya, where he is healed of his injuries and freed of the love, perhaps because Pepe is now dead. And here, with everybody else, Hisagi attempts to build a gateway to the royal palace with his Reiatsu before they come under attack by the army of black eyeball monsters created by the overflowing surplus of the Soul King's immense power. Hisagi, activating Shikai for the final time in the series, tries to fight off the Reiatsu army, only to be rescued by Aizen. And of course, this is a nice moment. It's nice to see the kind of vice captains, the seated officers coming together in shared disgust of Kyoraku's decision to free Aizen from prison. You know, Hisagi openly voices his disapproval, as he would, because Hisagi, you know, probably hates Aizen for what happened to Tosen, for the fact that he thinks that Aizen twisted Tosen's mind. Despite this, you know, Aizen is here to stay, and they're able to build the gate and make their way to the royal palace. Although Hisagi gets the honour of making it to the royal palace, which of course has now been transformed into the Quincy fortress of Varvelt, he charges it with the other Shinigami, only to fall behind as a result of his injuries and be sniped and taken out by Lil Barrow. By all accounts, a shot like that probably should have killed him. The shot blasts him here in the shoulder and presumably travels through his entire torso and comes out the other side of him. And it's enough to just totally take him out of the fight. But we learn from Can't Fear Your Own World that it's his Zanpakuto's true power that manages to save him. But of course, it's a ridiculous end for a character who has at this point kind of become something of a caricature, someone who was given such a great showing in the Fate Karakura Town arc, who people had such high hopes for, and I think wanted to see even more of, is just completely belittled, essentially, in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, ending in really the only way it can, with him being just sniped and taken out. Now, admittedly, a lot of Vice Captain level fighters are taken out by Lil, including potentially even Soifon, since she just totally vanishes at this point. But the fact that we see it happen to Hisagi is just so brutal for this guy. But 10 years later, he's apparently totally fine, and he heads to Rukia's inauguration ceremony. Along the way, he and his captain meet up with the 10th Division, where, of course, Hisagi is ruthlessly mocked by just about everyone for not using or even revealing his bankai despite claiming to have mastered it. That honestly felt very meta to me, like Kubo reached the end of the series, realised he'd never shown off Hisagi's bankai, and decided to poke a bit of fun at it. Maybe at this point Kubo knew that it would be revealed in Can't Fear Your Own World. I'm not entirely sure on the timeline of that, but regardless, it does feel a little bit mean-spirited towards the character. And then, of course, we have his very brief appearance in the Hell Arc. Mayuri is using a hologram to speak with all the divisions regarding the preparations surrounding Ukitake's Konso Reisai ritual, and when Matsumoto insults Mayuri, basically claiming that all of this tech is just merchandise, Mayuri seems to think that it's Hisagi who spoke and blasts a laser beam at him, really just cementing how Kubo feels about this character now. I think that he's now firmly rooted in the underdog status, in the comedic effect status. And later, Hisagi travels to Karakura with the other vice captains and fights the Hell Hollows. And that's basically it for everything Hisagi does in Bleach, his role outlined. Now, of course, he does play a big role in Can't Fear Your Own World as essentially the lead character. You can see him on the front cover of the first volume. I've made in-depth reviews of the entire trilogy of Can't Fear Your Own World, but to be honest, Hisagi does play such a big role here that I might just make a video in the future separately talking about the path he treads there. He becomes a slightly more serious character again in the light novels. In some ways, I think they do him some justice that was robbed of him based on the direction that Kubo is deciding to take him moving forwards, but let me know if that's something you'd like to see at all. But that's it for the video, guys. What do you think of Shuhei Hisagi as a character, the ever-faithful, ever-dedicated Vice Captain of the 9th Division? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. What's your favourite Shuhei Hisagi moment? I'd love to know all of that. Please do let me know below. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Make sure, like I said, to hit subscribe. And until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.